Well, thank you, Mr. Radabaugh, and good afternoon to everyone who's tuning in via the webcast. The literal handful of people who we have here, where you get to do things with a small number of people, but it's wonderful to be able to have the Sabbath. And so for all those who are joining in, it's great to have you. There was a kind of a mental shift for a lot of people. If you go back, it seems so long ago now, it's 13, 14 years ago, mid-2000s there, where the housing collapse, the bubble kind of burst, and the value of people's houses that had been just skyrocketing just plummeted. And as a result of that plummet, or at least partially as a result of that plummet, there kind of grew out of that a movement within architecture, within people's lives, of minimizing what they had. This concept there in architecture would be the tiny house concept. So people were pushing from having these big, huge, what were often called McMansions, these large homes, and they were moving towards smaller homes, tiny houses, ones that they could pick up and go somewhere, ones that you could maybe get for $15,000 or build yourself out of a container, out of a school bus, whatever it was. But the concept is basically that your home should only have what you actually need in it. And in doing this, you can make a much smaller home, because there are a lot of things you like, but what do you need in your house? If you think of an RV or a boat, there's not a lot of fluff there. Things that are there are very utilitarian. Things are there are things that you're going to use, because you just don't have the space for more extraneous things. So today I'd like to cover three concepts that would be relevant to us, not only in our discussion about tiny homes, but spiritually speaking. Three concepts that are relevant to you and to me building our very own tiny home. So even if you're not in the market for a tiny house, we're going to look at the concept here today. And the first one is design your tiny house. And designing your tiny house, if you had to pare down your life, to fit into a tiny house. Tiny houses are generally 1 to 300 square foot. If you're really going to push it, 400 square foot. By comparison, that's smaller than most two-car garages are today. Okay, so if you're going to live in a small abode, 1 to 300 square foot, what items would you need? What items would you want? A typical queen-size bed is about 6.5 foot long, or about 6 foot long, and it's about 5 foot wide. So that's 30 square feet. If it's 5 foot by 6 foot, that's 30 square feet. If you're living in a 100 to 300 square foot dwelling, what items do you want? What items do you need? And so designing your tiny house, building around that concept of what you can do to maximize your space, becomes an important thing. Second concept is actually living in your tiny house, because it can be very romantic. You're like, I like this idea. This is a good mental exercise for us to go through. I would like to draw out what I would like to do to convert that old school bus, to build out a shipping container, to design a tiny house. This is what I want to have. This is the kind of RV I would like to go for. But living in it is very different. And we have a few people in our congregations who like to go RVing, who are very familiar with really pared down living in that. But for those of us who might not be as familiar, it's one thing to design smaller and compact. It's another thing to actually live there. If you have children, or have ever traveled with children, or I wouldn't even say it with children, but maybe that's one of the more tactile experiences for individuals would be. But if you ever traveled for a long time, like perhaps going to the feast, and you've crammed yourselves either into a four-door sedan or into a van, and the amount of time it takes you to get to the feast, how excited are you to get out of that car? Because of the people who were taking over your space, the people who didn't recognize that, that you needed more arm room. Or maybe if you've even just been on an airplane. I was on a flight one time where it was great, because the pilot from the cockpit at the very start said, I just want you to know, those two, look at those two armrests that are right there in the middle of the seat. He said, those belong to the person who's sitting in that middle seat. They're not for the guy at the window. They're not for the guy on the aisle. You have your extra space. Those armrests are for the middle person. And I happened to be sitting in a middle seat on that flight, and I was like, this is glorious, right? Because the space is a premium. So in your tiny houses, you're thinking about what you might want, what you might need. Actually living in it, that second point there would be a little bit different. Now, a third thing that we're going to look at here is being okay with our tiny house. So you design it, you live in it, and then being okay with your tiny house. And I say this because there's always going to be someone who has a tiny house that is a tiny bit bigger, a tiny bit fancier than your tiny house. And if you have a used tent as your tiny house, and you notice somebody has an RV, and your RV can only go on land, and you're sitting there in your RV and you notice somebody else has got a boat, they can take their small, compact living across the ocean, around the world. Very often we have a mindset of, I can't wait until, right? If you're camping, I can't wait until I can sleep in my own real bed at home, right? Because the ground is a little bit more rough. I went to the Teton Challenger camp when I was a teenager, and I couldn't wait to get a shower with hot water and not have to bathe in a lake. Because there are things, do you need a big hot water and a shower in your tiny house? Maybe you do, right? Maybe you want those things. Maybe if you get that, you realize that you only have a hot water heater with a 5-gallon capacity, and your showering habits have to change, right? All these things, but being okay with your tiny house, you know. For those individuals who might be taller, I can't wait to actually stand up in a shower. Because those individuals who live on a boat or live in an RV, maybe it's a shortened height and you can't actually stand up. So what does all this have to do with us as followers of Christ? We're not just sitting here talking about building tiny houses, and while you may be doodling on your notepad and drawing things up and thinking about what the layout might be, I think that's fantastic. But we're not just talking about simplifying our lives. We're not just talking about selling off all the excess things that we have and consolidating. It's really about the spiritual principle of this. Because as you go through the exercise of building or designing and thinking about what you would do to live in your own tiny house, let's take that again with a spiritual overlay. And we consider that our tiny house, we get a week and a Sabbath. We get 6 days, one set aside specifically by our Father for time with Him. It's really all that we need. Because you can take the entire plan of God and it has been truncated into a week. While we love to have the 8 days, the 7 days, plus the 8th day for the Feast of Tabernacles, that is out His plan over the course of an entire year. And we do that every year. And that's a microcosm of the entire thing that He's striving to build. And we know that for Him, a day is as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is as a day. But He gives us this every week, a truncated, compact, everything that we need to have. A day today, the Sabbath day, that represents healing, represents unifying, represents the family, represents a time with Him. It's everything that we need. And if we grasp what the Sabbath truly means in the scheme of God's plan, then we can really design, live in, and be happy with our very own tiny home. So let's go back to those 3 points that we've already actually covered. Let's get into Scripture. The first one, remember, it was designing your tiny house. Designing your tiny house. God has given us a weekly micro view of His plan. Let's go to Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. How do we, as we think about this again, the week, the microcosm that He has given us here, the small snapshot every 7 days to look at, how do we design our Sabbath on a weekly basis? Do we plan for it in order to make it a success? Exodus chapter 16, verse 23, we read here, it says, God said to him, He says, through Moses, He says, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." He's giving them direction, showing them how to live, in essence, to sanctify the Sabbath day, to make it different, to prepare for it. Is today just a day that we get dressed up? Maybe you're at home and you're not dressed up. Maybe you are dressed up. Maybe you're wearing comfortable slippers like I am. What are you doing in preparing for the Sabbath? What are you doing to set it aside, to make this a compact, condensed, packed full, kind of like the tiny house, where everything is in there. Everything you need to survive is in there. Maybe you find out some good quality stuff, some different things that you can pack into that tiny house, but we have this week. And God has given us a finite amount of time, just like there's a finite amount of space in a tiny house. What are you going to include in your Sabbath day design? What are you going to include in that? Designing your tiny house, designing and planning for the Sabbath day. The second point that we talked about was living in your tiny house. It's one thing to design it, it's another thing to live in it. There's a good news article a few years back by Mr. John Ross Schroeder, titled God's Appointment with You, if you wanted to look that up on the UCG website. There's a quote there that says, "Our modern societies are not designed to begin, build, and enhance a proper relationship with our Creator. Instead, our society mostly widens the gap between God and ourselves, driving us far away from the divine help we all need to cope with life in an increasingly complex, fast-paced world. It is not set up to allow us to take into effect living in our tiny house, living in that week, focusing each week on God. It's not there to enable us and assist us with doing that. So where do we live? Do we live in the fast-paced world that pulls us away from that? Or do we live in a mindset and in the tiny house, in the mentality of following God? Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. Ephesians chapter 2, we'll pick it up in verse 19. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. We'll read 19 through 22. It says, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fit together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit." This is what we're supposed to be built into. There are other places where we know that we are, that the apostles and Christ are there as a foundation of the temple that is being built. Again, here, he's the chief cornerstone, but this is what we're being built into that holy temple, into the very house of God. Are we living in the house of the world? Or are we living in the house that God is wanting us to build? Live in our tiny house. The third point that we talked about was being okay with our tiny house. Being okay with our tiny house. What kind of mindset do we have towards the Sabbath? Towards the time that God has set aside? Are we looking back or longing like we kind of maybe do? Oh, it was a great Feast of Tabernacles. Or, oh, I'm looking forward to the Feast of Tabernacles. What are the rest of the feast days that he gives us? Chopped liver? What is the Sabbath every week? Is that meaningless? Are we just pining for the next thing? Oh, I just can't wait till 2020 is done. I'm looking forward to these other things. Well, we're in it. We are in today, right now, and what are we doing with that time? Are we longing for something else? Are we missing out, feeling like we're missing out on opportunities to learn and grow? Or are we taking advantage of the ones that we have here and now? Just for reference, consider Lot's wife. She was pining for something. She had, it was a different kind of protection, living in a cave in the mountains, Not what I would say, well, let's go on a camping trip, because we just lived in this very nice city. It had everything we needed. But she was longing and pining for something else. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah 58, as we're looking at the Sabbath, this has got to be one of the best memory scriptures about it. Yes, there are the 10 Commandments, talks about having it, but this, I feel, gets to so much of the heart of the day. We want to take advantage of the blessing of each Sabbath. Each Sabbath that we have, make the most of the opportunities that we have for growth and for learning. And as we're talking about where our mind is, being okay with our tiny house and not pining away for something else, for a better version, one that can move, one that's a little more comfortable. Let's look at this, Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13. It says, "If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath," God's Sabbath, right? "From doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, and not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words." If we do all of those things, if we make the most of the opportunity that we have been given on this day to focus on God, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. He's going to make our life and what it needs to be. He's going to give us the opportunities for growth that we need to have. He's going to give us the blessings of Jacob our father, that inheritance, the things that they looked to but didn't fully grasp what was being promised to them. So as we look at the Sabbath day, as we look at each week, let's be kind of like, for lack of a better phrase, in the moment, focusing on what God has given us. He's given us this life. He's given us each day, each week. Let's take advantage of that. Let's make sure that we are designing our tiny house, living in it, and being okay with what He's given to us.